got 4 children myself, all with autism. My son's now 27. He didn't really have much of a sort of education in his primary years because we didn't know what was wrong with him, really. We didn't know what was going on for him, and he was quite aggressive in school at times and very, very sensory, so he was excluded a lot and lots of assessments and things to find out what was happening. He was eventually diagnosed with autism, sensory integration dysfunction and dyspraxia and dyslexia. Went to a secondary school that was a specialist in boys on the spectrum, and then back into a mainstream sixth form with support. He's since then done his degree, so he got a first in his degree. He's just finished his PhD, so he's now a doctor. So even though he didn't have very much education to start with, he's progressed really well, and he's got a job, he's got his own house, he drives, he's got a girlfriend, so you know, he's doing really, really well. And then I've got 3 girls who are 25, 17 and 16. So my 25-year-old, she has got a PDA profile. So during adolescence in particular, she was extremely difficult at times, showing large amounts of distress, I would say. So rather than use things like challenging behaviour, I tend to use phrases like signs of distress and use low arousal approaches, and we'll talk a little bit about that as we go through. And then I've got a 17-year-old who's autistic and dyslexic, and my 16-year-old who is also a bit of a mix of all of my children put together. So she's autistic, dyslexic, dyspraxic, got sensory issues and a PDA profile. So she can be very difficult at times in not wanting to, well, she puts a lot of barriers in place, put it that way. So it's very difficult to encourage her to engage in certain things. But we do get there. We do get there eventually. So what I was going to start talking about is just a quick overview, really, of what PDA is. PDA was identified in the early 1980s by Elizabeth Mewson. It's now been accepted as part of the autism spectrum. It's driven by really high anxiety, but it's not currently included in any of the diagnostic manuals, which is why it's very difficult to get a diagnosis of it unless you go privately to somebody who has a lot of experience of PDA. So there are people around the country that will give out a diagnosis of PDA, but more often than not, what we actually see is a diagnosis of autism with a demand avoidant profile or demand avoidant traits, something along those lines. And it's very difficult because some clinicians even sort of question its existence, and I'm sure if they had a child themselves with that profile, they wouldn't be doing that because it's a very real thing. And I think it is a little bit tricky because people think, is it just autism with that demand avoidance, or is PDA something separate on its own? And that's something we'll have a quick look at as well. So the signs and symptoms of PDA are that they're usually passive in that first year of life, resisting and avoiding the ordinary demands of life. So that can be very simple things like getting up, getting washed, getting dressed, brushing your teeth. And sometimes that can have a sensory base, and sometimes that can just be autism. But it's the extreme that we see in that PDA profile that makes it stand out. Quite often they'll use social strategies as part of the avoidance. So they might use excuses, procrastination, they might slip into a fantasy world. And actually that's one of the things that sets it apart, I feel, from autism quite often. So my eldest daughter in school, if she didn't want to engage or she was finding things too much, she would actually pretend to be a cat or a dog. So she would bark at people, or she'd curl up in a ball and hide under a table. So she found ways to become something else so she could avoid the tasks that were being put forward to her. So they might often appear sociable on the, but it actually will be quite superficial. So I know, again, with my daughter, my eldest in particular, they would say, oh, she's got lots of friends, she'd be out playing in the playground, and you could, from afar, that would look typical. However, if you scratch below the surface, you would find that within that play she was very controlling, often called manipulative actually, which she wasn't. What she was trying to do was control her environment, control the play so that she felt safe. So it's about gaining a sense of safety. And they weren't typical friendships either. So, you know, she would be the one saying who was allowed to play, what the rules were, you know, and who wasn't allowed to play, and get very upset if that changed. So it was about control. Experience intense emotions and mood swings. We quite often see this, and we hear parents talk all the time about going from 0 to 60 in very few seconds. However, quite often what happens with our children when they've got this PDA profile is that they're already part way up the anxiety curve, if you know what it is, and we'll look at that later. So they haven't got far to go till they reach meltdown. So they're higher up that level of arousal already, and they rarely come down to that baseline. They might focus intently on other people. So that's one of the special interests that quite often our children have, is that they prefer to focus on people rather than things. So special interests in autism generally can be about people, but can have wider ranging things as well. Whereas particularly for my girls, it's been about other people. So it's been about the celebrity. My youngest, honestly, I'm surprised that she hasn't actually been done for stalking, because she'll get obsessed with a particular celebrity and want to know everything about them. And in fact, what she did at school was she selected mute, so she doesn't talk, or she didn't talk in school, and had a little whiteboard that she would write things on. And she had a new teacher, and she wanted to find out everything she could about this new teacher. And part of that was feeling safe with this new person coming in. However, for the poor teacher, she came in, she'd be delivering a lesson, and then my daughter would write things on the whiteboard like, I know when your birthday is, or I know you've got a cat, and things like that. And it actually scared the teacher. So we had to have a bit of a talk with her about that. But there's always this need for control, which is related to anxiety. Are there any questions so far? Everybody clear? Gosh, everybody's quiet. Okay, so we'll carry on. So what are demands? So what do we mean when we're talking about demands? Well, demands can be anything. It can be time. So putting a time limit on something can create a demand. I mean, I know that when I've got a deadline and I'm panicking and trying to get stuff done. So time, making plans, that can be a demand. And with our PDAs, we have to be really careful when we share what our plans are going to be. If we share them too far in advance, they get really worried about that and maybe overthink and get anxious about when that's going to be happening. If we leave it too late, it's too much of a sudden change, and that can upset them too. So we have to get that balance right of when we're going to share that information with them and what that will look like. Questions, so direct questions can feel like a demand. Decisions, making decisions and choices. And some of these things you will see an overlap with autism, because of course it is recognised as being on the spectrum, but making choices can be really difficult. And then there's something called uncertainty, or intolerance of uncertainty. That creates a demand. That's wanting to know what's going to happen next. It's a real fear of uncertainty and the unknown. And we're going to talk in more detail about that later. Praise. Now that sounds like it's a good thing, doesn't it? Now, praise for a child with PDA can feel like a demand, because praise implies that what you've done is really good and you're going to have to do it again. And actually, maybe next time you're going to have to do it even better. Okay, so when we praise within a PDA, what we tend to do is praise the thing that's been changed rather than the person. So going into their room, if they've tidied their room, saying, oh, what a lovely tidy room, rather than well done for doing your room. Okay, so things like that, we can change it so that we're offering the praise, but it's more indirect. Transitions. Transitions are loaded with demands in themselves. Okay, so transitions are a huge demand. Expectations, and this can be from others, but it can also be from self. Okay, so that can be internal expectations. My youngest child actually said to me that she doesn't like to tell anybody what she wants to do, because if she tells them, it means she then has to do it. So she won't share what she wants to do in life. She doesn't want people to know, just in case that doesn't happen and she has to do something else. So within all of this, there's a real fear of failure as well, and not getting things right. Sensory stuff, sensory difference can be a demand in itself. Even the things we want to do. So I don't know if anyone else has experienced this, where you sort of, the effort of going out to, I used to play badminton a long time ago, and sometimes I think, oh, I really don't want to go. And it is that feeling of a demand, isn't it? You've got to get ready, you've got to get there, you've got to go. Once I was there, I was fine and I really enjoyed it. But for our young people, sometimes the things that they want to do create too many demands for them to actually go through with it. And there's something else about that as well. Sometimes our PDAs will say that they really want to. An example I've got of a young person I work with is go to school. Okay, but what we find in PDA is some very sensitive neuroception in the way that threats and perceived threat is picked up. So cognitively, they may well be able to say, I would like to do this, but actually it's that innate sort of neuroception that will prevent them from going out the front door to actually do it. And then they can get frustrated with themselves as well. Okay. And then internal bodily demands. So on top of that, things like going to the toilet or eating can also be seen as a demand. And I know my eldest would say to me, because she's 25 now and she can verbalise things a lot more. She can say, I'll go to the toilet when I want to go to the toilet, not when my body is telling me to go to the toilet. So she would hold on as long as possible. And then even thoughts and desires can become demands. So just looking at that, you can see the huge amount of demands that would be included in daily life. People often ask me, I've got this slide in just simply because people often ask me, what is the difference between PDA and ODD? Now, my youngest child, actually, there's mention in her early diagnoses of ODD. Okay, so it can present as similar because it's that oppositional sort of behaviour that can come into play. So the real difference is that with PDA, it's part of the spectrum. Oppositional defiance disorder is not. It's not part of the spectrum. It's more of a behaviour issue. In PDA, quite often they will melt down and they're not really thinking about or worried about what peers think. With ODD, they're more concerned about what peers think of them and can be more controlled in their tantrums. PDA is present from birth, though you might not see it immediately from birth. It will be there. And ODD, most commonly we see that between the ages of 12 to 18, though you can see it in younger children, depending on their experiences of life. Okay. PDA is driven by anxiety, ODD by underlying negativity and pessimism. Okay, and there are links with possible excessive punishments or too many demands from adults. So quite often it will go with ADHD because we often see high levels of commands from adults in a child that's got ADHD. PDA is lifelong. Though we can do psychoeducation and teaching strategies to help them manage that anxiety and focus on reducing it. With therapy and support, young people can actually grow out of ODD. However, if they don't get that support, it can develop into more serious conduct disorders. So I just thought I'd put that in there because I think it's quite helpful to recognise the differences. So what might we see? We might see controlling behaviour, we might see inflexibility, procrastination, excuses, aggression. We might see masking, which sounds like that's not possible because if someone's masking, you're not going to see it, but there will be signs of masking. We might see manipulation. I'm not a fan of that word because I understand where that's coming from, but on the surface, it can look like manipulation. We might see withdrawal, we might see school refusal. Okay, and we might see separation anxiety. And I think what's important with the last two, school refusal, there's a study on the PDA website actually, that the level of school refusal we see in PDA can be around 50 to 70% of PDAs will be out of school. Typically developing children, the risk of school refusal is around 7.1%, and in autism that increases to 42.6%. But you can see that the risks of school refusal in PDA is really high. And we see real patterns actually, and I particularly see this in the girls where they'll have PDA, they manage to mask and hold things together throughout primary, but they'll go into secondary, and actually it's not long before they can no longer mask, they get to breaking point. And then a trigger will happen, so something like an illness might occur. So my oldest daughter, when she was 15, she actually got glandular fever and was off school for 3 months, and then found it really difficult to go back, even on a very part-time timetable. And separation anxiety, we use that quite negatively quite a lot of the time, but actually, you know, separation anxiety itself is an evolutionary thing that if somebody is not feeling safe, they will look to and want to be with their person that makes them feel safe. So sometimes I think we have to ask ourselves, what is it about the environment they're going into that makes them not feel safe? Because if we can change that, then we can change the separation anxiety. And the other thing to say about that, there is some research that suggests that attachment in autism looks different. And that makes sense, doesn't it? It would do, because they have different ways of building relationships. But if that attachment looks different in autism, we shouldn't really be comparing it with typical attachments. So what we also might see is this, so this quick escalation, and this is taken from the PDA Society, but I think it's a really helpful diagram really. You can see at the bottom we've got where they're calm and able, and then we rise up through these different sort of presenting behaviours really. So we might see when they're in the blue zone a lot of distraction, a lot of excuses and procrastination. Okay, as we go up into the purple, we can see they might make excuses like, I'm sorry, I can't do that, I've got no legs, or I've got no arms. My daughter used to say that quite a lot. I'd say, could you go and get such and such, and go, I can't, I've got no legs. And I used to think, well, clearly I can see that you have legs, you're just not willing to use them. That withdrawal into fantasy, so that becoming a dog or a cat or a character from a movie. So I've got a colleague who is a speech and language therapist, and she always knows the PDAs because they'll come in character quite often. So she says she'll get Alice in Wonderland come through the door, or Batman. So that withdrawal into fantasy. And then reducing meaningful conversation. I was working with a young person recently with PDA, trying to do some work. He said he wanted to do some work, he wanted to learn more about things, but every time you tried to have that conversation with him, he would say, so I did zones of regulation, for example, why does it have to be those colours? And I said, well, this is just a standard. I suppose we could change them to any colours you want. Doesn't make sense. Why is there blue? So anything you tried to do, there was all this distraction going on and reducing that meaningful conversation. And then we enter the orange zone, so that taking control, or sometimes we might have complete compliance, okay, which is can be actually a stress response. So we've got something called fawning, which is complete compliance, and it is about people pleasing really. So we might see that starting to come through in the orange, but we might also see it in the red as well. So we might also see masking. So they might mask their difficulties really well in school and come home and have that explosion, like the Coke bottle analogy. So a lot of our children, and if I use my daughter as an example, she was rarely at the green. She was usually in the blue during primary school, blue and purple. As she went through into secondary, and you've got to remember when you go to secondary, the expectations on our children get more. The social expectations become increased as well. And even expectations on themselves and being able to fit in, and they're managing a lot more at that point. All that will come into play. And actually, when my daughter went to secondary, I would say she spent most of her time in that orange and never coming out. So she was at a higher level of anxiety and feeling that she was losing that control. So it would not take much to send her into the red zone, where you might see self-harming behaviours, they might shut down, you might see aggression, you might see running away. You could see all of those things. And I could see all of those things in my daughter. And long term, it's not good to be living within that zone, you know, because our stress hormones, being in that constant state of fight, flight or freeze, being hypervigilant all the time, can be very difficult. And what we also see with that is a shrinking world. Okay. We'll just do this slide and then I'll see if there are any questions. So things that are less talked about in PDA quite often. What I've noticed working with families and in my own family as well is that that PDA child might have a preference for one parent to the detriment of the other. So quite often that's mum, not always, but quite often it is. So they will prefer mum to do the cooking, mum to do the driving around. I want mum to do it. That's their safe place. And actually what they can be to dad is quite challenging, really. I had a family where the daughter wanted mum to do everything. If dad did it, she would scream, she would shout, she would tell him to go away, call him nasty names, you know, and he felt very hurt by this. And it's not unusual for us to see that in families. They might show high levels of aggression and violence towards parents and siblings. We tend not to talk quite so much about that unless you're on some of the forums and chats, but it is something that can be very common, and I think that there is a bit of a stigma around it. You know, parents don't want to share that. They're worried that services might get involved, remove their child, or they're worried that, you know, people will think bad of their child. You know, they don't want their child to be looked on as this aggressive person, because we know that our children are not always like that, and there'll be a reason why they've become like that. Cannot seem to take responsibility, and I've put externally because I think quite often they do realise it's their fault but don't want to admit it, and they might internalise some of those feelings, so it's something to look out for. They might lie, not very well, but they might lie. One of mine, she didn't like using the toilets at school. She didn't like the hand dryers, she didn't like the smells, and I think she found that particularly difficult. So sometimes she would wet herself, and I can remember saying to her, "Have you wet yourself?" which is a really silly question, and she just said no. So she could lie, but it wouldn't be an elaborate story, but she might deny something. But absolutely hate being lied to. Okay, and when I say lied to, it doesn't have to be a real lie. It could be that I'm picking my daughter up and I'm late because there's been bad traffic. But to her, that is a lie. I'll just shut my door, just blown open. And when I've spoken to my daughter about that, she said, "You said you'd be here at past, it's now 25 to." And I said, "Yeah, but I got stuck in traffic." And she'll say, "You lied, you said you'd be here at past." And what she told me was, "What you don't understand, Mum, is in that 5 minutes, I thought, you're not coming to get me, you're dead in a ditch, you've had an accident, something terrible's happened," and her anxiety levels have gone up through the roof, and she's become very cross about it. So what I always try and make sure is that if I'm picking her up from anywhere and I'm running a bit late, that I've sent a text to let her know that, or, you know, I usually take one of my other daughters with me to get her, so she'll be texting and letting her know. This is an interesting one as well, would cut their nose off to spite their face. And if we've got any parents of PDAs in the room, I suspect they'll recognise this. So quite often my daughter, if she's had an argument with her dad, she will not speak to him for months and months and months. She doesn't care. She will not talk to him. And she would rather not see him ever again than go back down and apologise or start talking to him again. Now, her dad, that was my first husband, he's very similar. So quite often we have huge long periods of silence between the two when neither of them will back down. And maintaining a relationship with your child can be difficult at times when you've got a PDA. But all of this is because they spend every day feeling fearful. And what we have to do is try and understand what those fears are and try and support them to better manage that. Okay, are there any questions? Everyone's so quiet. Okay, so how do we manage a child with PDA? So the first thing to say, when a child is in crisis, it's not the best time to try and have a conversation with them. And taking this quote, I did a course in lower arousal approaches, and they said, when someone is drowning, it's not the time to teach them to swim. Okay, we have to get them out of the water first and make sure they're well before we can talk to them about what's going on. So when a child is melting down, it's not the time to start giving them a lecture. And firstly, we have to start thinking about behaviour differently as well. So that can be about changing our own beliefs and values in a way. So when we hear phrases, and there's three in particular that I've sort of reframed for myself, is challenging behaviour. They're showing challenging behaviour, but actually what they're doing is communicating signs of distress. Okay, if a child is behaving in a way that is challenging to us, then quite often they are trying to communicate that something is not right. The other one is attention seeking. So with attention seeking, quite often I will call that connection seeking. Because what I find is that, particularly with my youngest daughter, if I can invest 10 minutes with her when she really needs it and she's trying to make that connection, actually that prevents an escalation to a big meltdown. Okay, so quite often she took a shine, I don't know why, but to my mop of all things. So she called it Martha Mop, and she has it in the lounge with her. And when she really needs to connect with me, what she does, her behaviour starts to escalate a little bit, and then she gets Martha Mop out and she pokes me with it. And when Martha comes out, I know this is the time that whatever I'm doing, I have to stop and go and sit with her and see what it is she wants, give her a cuddle, you know, all of those things, and invest a little bit of time with her just so I can make sure that she's settled again. Because if I don't, then things will escalate further. So recognising those things that mean that your child is trying to connect with you, but doesn't necessarily have the skills to do it appropriately. Okay, so we have to teach the skills and we have to invest that time. So I'm not a huge fan of the term attention seeking. I prefer connection seeking because that's quite often what it is. And then school refusal. Our children are not refusing to go to school. They're simply not able to go to school. And when we reframe behaviours like that, it makes us think differently about it. So if you think of a child trying to communicate signs of distress through their behaviour, suddenly you're not seeing that as a personal sort of attack on yourself, or they're just being difficult or challenging. You sort of want to understand what that is so you can put it right. So reframing those things are really important. And actually, I got told this by a therapist that was working with my eldest daughter when she was at college. They said, view her meltdowns as a panic attack, because actually that's what they are. Okay, because when she was a teenager, she could become extremely volatile and aggressive at times. Things would be thrown, she'd be screaming and crying, and you couldn't calm her down at all. And I was told by the therapist that's when she's having a panic attack. That's when she's her most vulnerable, really. Okay. So you may well have seen the behaviour iceberg before. I use this quite a lot. We use it on Signet. So what can we see at the top? That presenting behaviour. So you might see somebody having a meltdown. You might see somebody refusing and being non-compliant. But actually, what is going on below that surface? This is where we become a bit of a detective. So, you know, is it something sensory going on for them? Is it anxiety? What are the issues that we're trying to address? Because if we keep dealing with that presenting behaviour and don't address the things below the surface, nothing will change. Okay? Because dealing with that presenting behaviour at the top doesn't teach new skills. Yeah, it doesn't help to reduce anxiety. It's an in-the-moment thing, and it will be temporary. And quite often, our children won't know what behaviour they're supposed to replace it with. The likely triggers below the surface, I always look at first, would be anxiety, sensory, and communication. Okay, so those are the three big ones. Once we've dealt with those, you're likely to see a reduction in behaviour naturally. So if we can look at those, that's really helpful. Some people with the sensory, and we'll talk more about this in a minute, don't understand quite the significance of it. Okay, and how important that environment is to our young people. So, anxiety, this is the main driver for PDA, and you might recognise some or all of these in your children. I've already mentioned that strong links with school refusal and selective mutism. So, anxiety presents itself in many ways, and, you know, I think that quite often when we think of anxiety, we think of a child that's maybe withdrawn, worrying about things and being quite quiet. But actually my experience is you get far more of the defiance and other challenging behaviours with anxiety that are misinterpreted. You might have avoiding activities, the desire to control people and events. So all of these things, and on here again, we've got intolerance of uncertainty. Okay, so struggling to pay attention and focus. All of these things can be related to anxiety. So these are the things that you might see in the top of that iceberg. And then this is an anxiety curve. Sorry, my dog is going to start barking now. This is the anxiety curve. So at the bottom, we've got the baseline. We're at number 1, and we're going to, any trigger can increase our level of arousal, and we will travel up this curve. For some of our children, like I said earlier, they might already be at a 3 or 4, so it won't take much to take them up to a 5. Just bear with me 1 second. I'm just going to take my dog out. Sorry about that, she snuck in when my door blew open. So we're travelling up this curve. If we can catch it early enough, so if we can catch it at number 2, we might be able to bring that back down quite easily. If we get to a number 3 or 4 and we actually try and intervene, then what we might do is just escalate the behaviour straight up to a number 5. Okay, so what we need to do is be really mindful of the signs of our child rising up this curve and teach them about it as well. So I'm really an advocate for self-awareness, for children learning about themselves and helping them and giving them the tools and strategies to be able to manage some of these things. And that takes time. You don't do an activity like the Incredible 5-point scale, for example, and then the next day be able to use it. Okay, so it takes time. And whilst they're going up this curve, what we have to do is try and remain at number 1. Okay, which is the hardest thing to do, because if we're not calm, we go up there with them, we escalate it, and actually what we also do is we prolong it as well. And then as they're coming out of meltdown and going down the other side of the curve, well, if we try and go in at a number 4 or number 3 and say, what was all that about then? We're going to send them back up into meltdown. What we have to do is wait for them to come back down to their baseline. Now, the thing on this particular curve that it doesn't show is that there's usually a dip below that baseline when they come out of meltdown. So quite often, young people who've had a huge meltdown will come out of it, but they will dip. So my son, when he was little, for example, used to come home from school, say he had a headache, or you know, he would be tired and want to lie on the sofa, and that was burnout really from that meltdown. So he would be below that baseline. So sometimes we have to wait for them to come back out the other side before we talk to them, and how we talk to them needs to have some sensitivity around it as well. Okay, right. I've spoken a little bit already about intolerance of uncertainty. So this is the fear of the unknown. Anybody who has high anxiety or an anxiety disorder will have some form of intolerance of uncertainty. So it's a fear of the unknown, or a fear of failure, it can be as well. If you think of the symptomology of autism and PDA and that rigid thinking, you can understand why there would be high levels of intolerance of uncertainty in that particular population. Okay, so that lack of flexibility, also some of the sensory stuff, which we'll talk about in a minute, all can lead to that intolerance of uncertainty. And it's that that leads to the anxiety. But what anxiety does is it actually increases rigidity. So they become even more inflexible and more rigid and want even, you know, more control and to know what's going to happen next. So the child's world actually gets smaller and smaller because you have this ever decreasing circle. Okay. Then the other thing that feeds into anxiety is sensory difference. So if you have a child, particularly if they've got difficulties around proprioception and their vestibular system and being able to navigate themselves through busy environments, that all increases anxiety and can make them hypervigilant. But then what anxiety does to the body is it actually heightens sensory difference. So again, we have this ever decreasing circle. And when our children are in this state, they are overwhelmed. So quite often they're living in this state of overwhelm. And when you're in that state of overwhelm, you are less able to be empathic because you're just focusing on surviving. But what this model does is it suggests that anxiety should not be addressed in isolation. We need to understand the role of intolerance of uncertainty. And actually there is some work by Rogers et al. I think it's at Sheffield University, that he's been doing on intolerance of uncertainty and links to anxiety. And they've just developed and piloted a course called Cues, which is coping with uncertainty in everyday situations. And fortunately, I was on the first cohort to get trained. I haven't used it yet, but I have done the training in it. And that focuses on helping young people become more tolerant of uncertainty and hoping that that will, in turn, reduce those levels of anxiety. And then there's something else called alexithymia, which is that inability to identify and name your own emotions. And they think now that that is linked to our interoceptive sense, so is a sensory difference, and that too can create anxiety. Okay. Are there any questions about that at all? No. No, I thought I'd put this in because my daughter drew this. She just came to me one day and she'd said, "Mum, I've drawn you this." She's, as I've mentioned, selective mute. And she's done this as my world at home versus my world with anxiety. So my world at home, safe, happy, loved, fun, talkative, myself. It's a colourful, bright, full of life world. And then she's got her selective mute world, where she's scared, anxious, vulnerable, insecure, silent, someone who isn't me. and that world is dead dull and nervous. And I just thought when she did it, it's such a powerful image of how our children can be different in 2 different environments, you know, and how that anxiety and, you know, in her case, her selective mutism as well, which is an anxiety disorder, how that impacts on who she is when she's not at home. And I just thought it was a really powerful visual. So sensory difference, we're not talking just the 5 traditional senses, we're talking about vestibular and proprioceptive sense and the interoceptive sense as well. These are not static, can change over time, and it can be that we experience increased sensitivities at times of stress as well, and at times of change in our body. So those hormonal changes throughout adolescence, we might have our sensory differences heightened, or they might change. Some people can be hypersensitive and some are hyposensitive, or you can be both, and you can move between the 2. So it's quite a complex thing to gauge, really. But I would be led by the child, because quite often they're very good at telling us through observation of their behaviour, but also verbally when they get older, of the things that help and the things that don't help. Now, the sensory difference can be a cause of anxiety, but also of some very strange behaviours as well. So it's something to really monitor. I spoke to a mum yesterday who said, no, I don't think she's got any sensory differences about her daughter. But then she went on to list, but, you know, she does complain about her clothing. She's always wearing shorts. She's always doing this. And actually there was quite a lot of sensory difference going on that mum hadn't really picked up on. And then the interoceptive sense. So there are some, Kelly Marler's got a really good website. It's got some free downloads on it, which, you know, the interoceptive sense has a huge impact on everyday life for our young people. And quite often we're not aware of it. So as well as being things like knowing when you need the toilet, knowing when you're hungry, knowing when you're full, thirsty, you know, understanding what your body is telling you, all of those things are interoception, but also it covers a lot more, as you can see from this slide. And as I've mentioned, alexithymia is thought to be part of that. And then communication. This is something that gets missed quite a lot, and we need to rethink about how we communicate with our children sometimes. So my daughter, I realised, my eldest one, she found face-to-face conversation very confrontational, and actually she found it quite difficult. So as she became a teenager and got a phone, I used to text her quite a lot, you know, particularly if I wanted her to do something, because I found that if I put it in writing on a text, because she likes written word, she would read it and reread it. She wouldn't respond immediately. So if I was having a conversation and I said I thought it'd be nice, said no, you know, you wouldn't even get through the question or the task. But putting it in writing and giving it to her in that way was much better. So it reduced the number of outbursts that we had. But also she did actually, 9 times out of 10, she would do what she was asked on the text, because, you know, like I say, she had time to process it. So what is their preferred communication style? How can we communicate differently? We always assume that speaking is the way to go, don't we? That's the natural way that we talk, and everything in life is set up for verbal communication quite often. And we need to rethink that, because for some people that is too demanding. Okay, and never assume, be explicit and join the dots up, because sometimes we think that our children should know something, and unless we're explicit with that, they won't necessarily pick up on it. So the lady I was talking to yesterday said that I didn't understand it, the dishes were still in the sink when I got home, and so she was complaining about her autistic daughter not tidying up while she'd been out, and she said, and then I was really shocked, because my daughter just said, well, you didn't tell me to do it. So Mum had just assumed that because it was there, she would know that that's what needed to be done. So we need to be explicit, and we need to join the dots for our children, because they don't always get it. One thing I would say that I found as my daughter's got older, if I am communicating verbally, and I need to tell her something that I know she's not going to like, because as a parent you always know the things that are going to trigger something. I quite often give her the heads up by going, "Ooh, I've got something to tell you and you're not going to like it." And then quite often she go, "Oh, that wasn't so bad after all." Or I might say, "I've got some news. Do you want the good news or the bad news?" And quite often she'll say the bad news first. And because she's prepared for something awful, quite often it's not quite as bad as she's imagining or expecting. So we know that with PDA, traditional strategies are unlikely to work. So I know that where you would normally see behaviour such as we see in PDA, the advice would be more boundaries, be stricter, routines, but actually quite often that will escalate behaviour in a PDA child because it's taking away their control that they need. Beware of reward charts. If you're doing a reward chart, make sure it's not around something emotional, like not having a meltdown, because what tends to happen, a child might mask then and internalise those feelings. Reduce demands where possible. Aim to give as much control or perceived control as possible. And that's the trick here, is we can make things look like they're in control of something, but having overall control ourselves. Do limited choices, use distraction diversion, validate feelings and be empathic. And some of the strategies we use feel counterintuitive, but actually they work, so stick with it. So, rewards, praise, sanctions or consequences, boundaries, these are all things that are likely to escalate behaviours. So these are all the typical things that we would use in managing behaviour that are more likely in a child with PDA, escalate them. And when we're thinking of low demand, that doesn't mean no demand. Okay, so I think that sometimes when we talk to parents, they think, oh gosh, I've got to take every single demand out. And that's not the case. We're just reducing them and prioritising them. So some things will be non-negotiable. So if there's a safety issue, then that just has to happen. And where possible, we need to avoid standoffs and power struggles. So this is something from Sally Catt, who is an adult with PDA, and her statements that she finds very demanding. She's put, so a command like "you must go out" would be ultra high, whereas an assumption, my daughter hates people assuming things. You'll love going here, that's quite high as well. So I just thought it was a nice little thing to put in the slides for you. And then phraseology and tone, so subtle adaptations to our language and tone can actually support our parenting, starting with please rather than ending with it. And even simple things like saying things like the clothes are on the bed, I'm happy to help, and then walking away when they're getting ready for school in the morning, rather than saying you need to get dressed now, can be helpful as well. And I love that I wonder what shoes you're wearing today, or I wonder whether, you know, who can get to the lamppost first. Those sorts of I wonder statements can be really helpful in encouraging our children to do things, and they don't see it quite so much as a demand. This is quite tricky. Avoid trigger words like no, because no is a trigger word for a child with PDA. And perhaps use things like, I'm afraid it's not possible right now, but perhaps we can do it when. You know, what I tend to do with my own children, if they want something that I can't do right now, is I'll tell them when I can do it. So I make sure that they know when something can happen, rather than just give them the no, that's not happening, because they might feel that that's forever. So giving them that alternative, and also explaining reasons and offering those alternatives can be really helpful in avoiding that escalation. And what you have to remember is some of this stuff seems really hard and intense at the time, but as you practice it, it becomes more natural, and there will become a point where that level of anxiety will reduce again, and they'll be more open to some of the demands. So it's not forever either. I can get away with things with my girls now that I couldn't, say, a few years ago, because I know when and when I can't push that a little bit. Okay. Manage environmental triggers, so putting your sensory goggles on and looking at possible triggers in the environment, because these are probably some of the easier things that we can change and adapt to get a different result. And then low arousal approaches. I mean, the low arousal approach is a non-confrontational way of managing those signs of distress. So when a child is in a meltdown, try and stay or appear calm. So fake it till you make it, you know, and again, this takes practice. Avoid direct eye contact if possible. Avoid physical touch, because that can increase levels of arousal. You can use gestures instead of speech, but make sure they can't be misinterpreted. So these are things that you've agreed when they've been in a state of calm. Slow down all your movements. Remove others if possible. If you've got siblings or if they're in a school, try and avoid that audience effect, because actually that adds to the embarrassment for that young person. One person should be communicating. So often less is more. Okay, and I've been into school to collect my youngest daughter, where she was in a classroom on her own and she was surrounded by 5 teachers, and I thought, what message is that sending her? So be aware of those power messages. If your child's on the floor, get on the floor as well. You know, don't stand over them, because that's a power imbalance. Keep your distance if it's safe to do so. I mean, obviously, sometimes if someone is going to hurt themselves or is hurting someone else, then we need to maybe get involved. However, in most instances, we can keep at least an arm's distance away, because that alone can reduce a level of arousal. And then tactically withdrawing if it's safe to do so. So these are all things that we can use to when somebody's in a meltdown, to reduce the length and allow them that time to calm down. And then really importantly, self-awareness. So teach your child about PDA, or see if someone at school can do this if they would prefer it from somebody else. Teach ways of managing that anxiety and appropriate ways to meet the sensory needs, because sometimes with the sensory needs we might need to replace a behaviour, so they're still getting that same feedback and that need met, but in a more appropriate way. And self-awareness is really important. There's a study by Cooper et al. In 2017 that says that having a positive autism identity can actually promote positive self-esteem and positive mental health in the future. And encourage them to write down or tell others how their PDA feels to them. I think as they get older, I've done a lot of work with this, particularly with my youngest, where she's really good at being able to, she produced her own communication sort of diary, if you like, so for school, to tell them exactly what helped and what didn't help. Now, the thing with that is that it's brilliant and really, really helpful, but sometimes they'll put things in there that you know is not possible. So my youngest had put in hers things that don't help, working with other students. Well, we know that's never going to happen. However, what we can do with that information is understand that she finds group work really hard, and how can we support that, and how can we build that up so that she can manage it better. There's also another tool called A 5 Can Make Me Lose Control, which I love. It's an activity sorting tool, really, where you have lots and lots of activities that would happen throughout the week in a child's life, and they rate them from 1 to 5. So 1, I can handle this, up to 5, which was this would make me lose control or make me highly anxious. I did this with one young person who wanted to add 6, so he actually had a number 6, and this will make me go on a rampage. And it's really insightful how they sort them. Sometimes they're not always honest when they first do it, and we have to question some of those, but usually they're really, really good, and it will draw out things. So I did this with a young person last week, and the mum said, I never knew she had an issue with reading. She's never told us that. And when her mum asked her more detail about that, and more specific things around it, it was that she found it really difficult to focus, and she could only read sort of half a page before feeling really tired. So, and that was news to mum. and I think it can draw out some really interesting and helpful things to enable us to put the right support in for that individual child. And if people are interested, I have got like an anonymous version of one that I've done that people can have a look at. And then getting support. So parents of children with autism suffer more stress than parents of children with other disabilities, including Down syndrome. So I think what that says is it's about hidden disabilities. It's about the judgment that we receive as parents for having children with hidden disabilities. It's about the battles that parents face on a daily basis to get the support and get the help that they need. And it just shows, I think, that there is one study that says that parents suffer the same levels of stress as a combat soldier. So we're talking really high levels of stress. What helps is talking to other parents in similar situations. And from the research, we know that there is ways that families where there's a child with autism and PDA can become more resilient. And quite often that's making sense of their situation, learning as much as they can about autism and their child's needs. But the other one is peer support. So that support can be a huge source of help. And if things get too much, talk to your GP and make sure you get that support. So in conclusion, PDA is really driven by anxiety. Low arousal approaches should form the basis of support, because what we want to do is calm everything down and bring down that level of anxiety. Changing our own responses will actually elicit the most change. Maintaining relationships is really important. Reducing demands where possible. Considering those alternative ways to communicate. Self-awareness. And actually remember, there are lots of tools out there that we can use with children, but the best resource is ourselves. Okay, and I have a lovely story that I was in the car with Rebecca and Angel, my two younger girls, and at the time Rebecca was about 15 and she was being a real teenager, and oh, what's the meaning of life? I hate it. What's the point of everything? She was really complaining. And my daughter Angel piped up. She goes, I know the meaning of life. And I said, oh, this will be interesting. What's that, Angel? And she said, people change people. And I said, that's right, Angel, people do change people. And we had a big discussion about, how relationship can facilitate the best change in people. And she went, no, it just means people change people. And I said, where did you get it from? And she said, Girl Meets World, which was one of her favourite programmes at the time. So she uses a lot of delayed echolalia where she'll drop stuff in and it's always within context. So she can be really good fun. But she's right, people do change people. And it's really important that actually we look after ourselves so we can be that person to facilitate that change. And that's the end of the presentation. So I don't know if anyone's got questions now. You're all very quiet throughout all of that. I thought it was going to be, thought you were all going to be really chatty. So has anybody got any questions?